My name is Eulalia Brooks. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my professional life, I've worked in environments where the loudest voice in the room usually gets the credit. I've never been that voice. I live in Seattle, and at the time this story began, I worked as a systems operations coordinator for a mid-sized technology company. My job wasn't glamorous. I didn't lead presentations. I didn't dominate meetings. I was the person who made sure things actually worked after everyone else finished talking about them. Most people who met me for the first time formed the same impression within a few minutes. Quiet, polite, reliable, the kind of coworker who would fix a problem without making a scene about it. And if I'm being honest, that perception didn't bother me at first. There's a certain freedom in not being the center of attention. When people underestimate you, they also stop watching you very closely. They assume they already understand who you are. What they don't realize is that silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it just means observation. The story I'm about to tell you didn't begin with an argument, a dramatic betrayal, or a moment of explosive conflict. It started with something much smaller, something almost ordinary. An early morning meeting. Our entire department was called into an emergency meeting at 6:30 a.m. No explanation, no agenda. Just a message from upper management was sent late the night before, asking everyone to be present. In a technology company, a meeting like that usually means one thing: a catastrophic outage, a security breach, some kind of overnight disaster that no one wants to put in writing yet. So when we walked into the conference room that morning, most of us assumed a major system failure had occurred overnight. What none of us realized was that the real reason the meeting had been scheduled had nothing to do with the systems. And when the truth finally surfaced, the reaction across the room was something I'll probably never forget. Shock, confusion, a few quiet attempts at damage control, because the problem everyone thought they were about to fix had already been quietly set in motion long before that meeting ever appeared on the calendar. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This is not a story about revenge. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, no clever speeches where someone finally gets what they deserve. It's a story about something quieter than that. About what happens when people slowly grow comfortable overlooking someone. And how much can change when that person finally decides to stop playing the role everyone else assigned to them. Looking back now, I don't think anyone in that room truly meant for things to unfold the way they did. But intentions don't always protect people from consequences. And sometimes the most significant turning points in our lives begin in rooms that feel completely ordinary. So before I take you into what happened next, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever been in a place where people had already decided who you were before they ever really tried to understand you? If you had asked anyone in my department who Eulalia Brooks was, the answers would have sounded almost identical. Oh, she's great, super reliable. She keeps everything organized. Honestly, I don't know how we'd survive our deployments without her. All of that sounded positive on the surface. And technically it was, but there was always something missing in the way people said it. No one ever described me as strategic. No one ever described me as important. I was useful. There's a difference. In our company, usefulness lived in the background. Strategy lived in the spotlight. The people who made decisions spoke in meetings. The people who implemented them worked quietly after the meetings ended. I belonged firmly in the second group. My job title was Systems Operations Coordinator, which meant I handled the invisible infrastructure behind most of our department's work. I tracked system rollouts, documented changes, monitored overnight processes, and made sure nothing quietly broke while everyone else focused on the bigger picture. When something went wrong, people came to me. When something went right, people thanked the team. It wasn't unfair exactly. It was just the way the structure worked. Over time, you start to notice patterns. In meetings, I was usually seated along the wall rather than at the center of the table. My laptop stayed open while others spoke, and I took notes because someone needed to remember the details everyone else was casually promising. Occasionally, I would offer a suggestion. Sometimes people nodded. More often, the room kept moving forward, as if my comment had simply been part of the background noise. I didn't take it personally. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth is, when you spend years being the person who quietly fixes problems, people begin to assume that's all you do. They stop asking what you see. They stop wondering what you know. And the strange part is, you often let them. Because the alternative, pushing for recognition, interrupting louder personalities, insisting your voice deserves space, never felt natural to me. I've always believed competence should speak for itself, but workplaces don't always function that way. Some of the most confident voices in our department belonged to people who had only been there a fraction of the time I had. They used phrases like big picture strategy and vision alignment, words that floated comfortably in presentations but rarely appeared in the documentation that kept our systems functioning. My role wasn't to challenge them. My role was to make sure their ideas didn't accidentally crash the network. And most days, I was perfectly fine with that. I had my routines. I arrived earlier than most people. I liked the quiet of the office before the conversation started, the hum of servers in the operations room, the soft glow of monitoring dashboards, the predictable rhythm of systems running exactly as they should. There's a certain peace in environments that reward attention to detail. And attention to detail was something I had in abundance. Over the years, I had documented nearly everything: system updates, deployment histories, access logs, decision timelines, meeting notes that quietly captured the difference between what people promised and what they actually implemented. Not because anyone asked me to, because that's just how my brain worked. If something mattered, I wrote it down. To most of my coworkers, that habit probably looked like simple organization. Another sign that Eulalia Brooks was dependable, meticulous, and slightly introverted. The kind of person who prefers spreadsheets to spotlight. What they didn't realize was that when you spend years quietly recording how things actually happen inside an organization, you begin to see patterns other people miss. You notice who takes credit. You notice who forgets decisions. You notice which systems depend on which people. But at that time, those observations were just that. Observations. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't keeping score. I wasn't waiting for an opportunity. I was simply doing my job. And as far as the department was concerned, my role was already perfectly defined. Reliable, organized, invisible. Looking back now, I think that assumption shaped everything that followed. Because when people are certain they understand your place in the room, they stop noticing when that place begins to change. If you asked me today when everything truly began, I wouldn't point to the emergency meeting. I would point to something much smaller. A sentence in a conference room that almost everyone forgot within a few minutes. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon during one of our routine project meetings, the kind where half the department gathers around a long table, laptops open, coffee cups scattered between notepads and charging cables. The discussion that day focused on a new internal monitoring system our team was preparing to deploy. It wasn't a glamorous project, but it mattered. The system would track automated processes across multiple departments, and if something failed, it needed to notify the right people immediately. A lot of moving parts. A lot of small details that could quietly cause problems later if they weren't handled correctly. As usual, my role in the meeting was simple. Listen, document decisions, flag potential technical conflicts if they appear. The project lead, Marcus Ellison, stood at the front of the room, presenting slides that outlined the deployment timeline. Marcus was confident, articulate, and very comfortable speaking in front of groups. He had joined the company about a year after I did, but had quickly moved into a leadership track. People liked Marcus. He had energy. He spoke in bold, future-focused language that made projects sound exciting. About halfway through his presentation, he outlined a step involving the automation scripts that would connect our monitoring system to several internal databases. I remember glancing at my laptop screen and noticing something immediately. The access permissions in his diagram didn't match the current database structure. If implemented exactly as shown, the scripts would fail quietly in the background. The system wouldn't trigger alerts correctly, which meant certain failures might go unnoticed for hours. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was the kind of flaw that could slowly cause headaches later. So I raised my hand slightly and spoke. Marcus, I think the access layer there might still be using the old permissions map. The database team updated that structure 2 months ago. The room paused for a moment. Marcus looked at the slide, then back at me. For a second, I thought he might ask me to elaborate. Instead, he smiled lightly and said, "We'll double-check that later, but the architecture team already signed off on this version." A few people nodded. The conversation moved forward. Technically, that should have been the end of it. Meetings move quickly, people miss details, clarifications happen later all the time. But something about the moment lingered with me. Not because Marcus disagreed, because of the way the room reacted. No one asked a follow-up question. No one checked the documentation. The discussion simply continued as if my comment had been a minor interruption rather than a potential system issue. I wrote a short note in my leather notebook. Verify database permission mapping for monitoring scripts. Then I kept listening. About 10 minutes later, as Marcus wrapped up the slide, he summarized the deployment plan for the group. And thanks to the architecture review last week, he said, we're confident the system integration will run smoothly. I looked at the slide again, the same diagram, the same incorrect access layer. Most people probably didn't notice. And if the issue got fixed later during implementation, the meeting itself wouldn't matter. Still, I remember sitting there with my pen resting against the notebook page, thinking something quiet but unfamiliar. Not frustration, not anger, just awareness. Because moments like that don't exist in isolation. They're small signals, a suggestion acknowledged politely but not examined, an observation noted but not explored, a quiet reminder that some voices in a room naturally carry more weight than others. When the meeting ended, people packed their laptops and continued their conversations in the hallway. Marcus walked past me with a friendly nod. Good catch earlier, he said casually. We'll circle back on that if needed. Then he kept walking. I watched the conference room empty out, closed my notebook, and returned to my desk. At the time, I didn't think of it as a turning point, just a minor moment in an ordinary workday. But sometimes the first shift in a long story begins with something that almost no one else notices. A small cut, quiet, easy to ignore, but not completely forgotten. After that meeting, nothing dramatic happened. No arguments, no system failures, no awkward follow-up emails. In fact, the next few weeks looked completely normal from the outside, which is exactly why the pattern took a little longer to recognize. At first, I assumed the permissions issue would eventually come back to me for review. That's usually how things worked. If a deployment involved system integrations, someone from engineering would check the documentation or ask operations to confirm the configuration, but no one asked. A week passed, then another. The project continued moving forward through the usual channels: architecture approvals, timeline adjustments, and presentation updates. Every time the monitoring system appeared on a meeting agenda, I listened carefully. And every time, the same diagram appeared on the slides. The same incorrect access layer. The first few times I noticed it, I almost said something again. But there's a subtle pressure in professional environments that people don't talk about very often. Not the kind that comes from rules or authority, the quieter kind that grows from social rhythm. If you point out the same issue twice, you risk sounding difficult. If you push too firmly, you risk being labeled negatively. So I told myself something reasonable. They must have already fixed it behind the scenes. It was a comfortable assumption, and comfortable assumptions are very easy to accept. Still, the small feeling from that Tuesday meeting hadn't completely disappeared. It stayed somewhere in the back of my mind, not urgent, not emotional, just present. One afternoon, about 3 weeks later, I walked past the collaboration area near the engineering desks and overheard part of a conversation. Marcus was speaking with 2 developers who had recently joined the company. He was explaining the monitoring system project. I didn't intend to listen. I was simply passing by on my way to refill my coffee. But a familiar slide appeared on the large screen behind them. The diagram again. The same one. Marcus gestured toward the access layer as he described how the automation scripts would connect to the databases. This part's pretty straightforward, he said. Architecture already validated the permission structure. The developers nodded, making notes. I stopped for a moment near the coffee machine, pretending to focus on the brewing screen while I looked at the diagram again. Nothing had changed. Same outdated permissions map. Same potential failure point. For a few seconds, I considered walking over and clarifying it. It would have taken less than a minute. Actually, that database structure changed recently. Problem solved, but I didn't move. Instead, I waited until my coffee finished brewing and returned quietly to my desk. Not because I was afraid to speak, because I had already spoken. And something interesting happens when people begin to realize their input doesn't significantly alter the direction of a conversation. They stop repeating themselves. Not out of resentment, out of efficiency. Later that afternoon, I opened the system documentation portal and checked the monitoring project folder. The deployment notes had been updated. The architecture summary referenced Marcus's presentation, and under the section labeled Database integration layer. The diagram from the meeting had been uploaded as the official reference. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I opened my notebook and wrote a single line beneath the earlier note. Permissions map discrepancy still present in official documentation. I wasn't keeping score. At least, I didn't think I was. But writing things down has a way of preserving clarity. It separates what people believe happened from what actually did. Over the next month, similar moments began appearing in small, almost forgettable ways. Ideas I mentioned briefly would resurface later in meetings, framed as new suggestions from someone else. Questions I raised would be acknowledged with polite nods before the conversation continued without addressing them. Nothing rude, nothing openly dismissive. Just a slow, consistent pattern where my contributions blended into the background. And the strange thing was, I understood why. People weren't intentionally ignoring me. They simply already knew who I was in their mental map of the department. Eulalia handles documentation. Eulalia tracks operations. Eulalia makes sure the details don't get lost. Valuable work, but not the kind associated with leadership or decision-making. So when I spoke, the room heard it the same way people hear the hum of an air conditioner. Important for the environment, but not something they needed to focus on. At least that's how it felt at the time. And for a while, I accepted it as part of the role I had quietly grown into, until the day I realized something important. The role others assign to you only remains permanent if you continue performing it exactly the way they expect. It took me a long time to recognize the role I had been given in the department, not because it was hidden, because it was comfortable. When you're the reliable person in a workplace, people depend on you in ways that feel almost flattering. They trust you with details. They ask you to review documents. They know that if something small goes wrong, you'll quietly fix it before it becomes a bigger issue. At first, that kind of trust feels like respect. And in many ways, it is. But there's a subtle difference between being trusted to handle work and being trusted to shape decisions. One afternoon, that difference became unusually clear. We were in another planning meeting for the monitoring system rollout. This time, the room was slightly fuller. A few managers from other teams had joined because the system would eventually affect their departments too. Marcus stood at the front again, presenting an updated timeline. I sat in my usual seat along the wall with my laptop open and my notebook beside it. At one point, the conversation turned to risk mitigation. What would happen if the automation scripts failed during the first deployment phase? One of the managers asked, "Do we have someone on standby who can troubleshoot quickly if something breaks?" Marcus nodded without hesitation. "Oh yeah, operations has that covered," he said casually. Then he glanced toward me. "Eulalia basically knows the whole system inside out. If anything unexpected happens, she'll catch it." A few people looked in my direction and smiled. Someone said, "That's reassuring." Another person added, "Good to know we have a safety net." Safety net, I heard the phrase and wrote it down automatically in my notebook. Not because it offended me, because it was accurate. That was the role. Not the architect, not the strategist, not the person deciding how the system would be built. The safety net. The person who would catch problems after everyone else finished making decisions. Marcus continued speaking. "We'll push the deployment overnight on a Saturday. If there's any hiccup, operations can patch things quickly before Monday." Again, a few people nodded. No one asked whether operations had been consulted about that schedule. No one asked whether I had reviewed the final architecture. The assumption was already built into the conversation. Eulalia will handle it. It wasn't malicious. Marcus wasn't trying to dismiss my expertise. In fact, in his mind, he was probably complimenting it. But the structure of the conversation made something clear. My knowledge was valuable after decisions were made, not during them. And strangely, that realization didn't make me angry. It made me curious. Because once you clearly understand the role people expect you to play, you begin to notice how consistently they rely on that expectation. After the meeting ended, I walked back to my desk and opened the deployment documentation again. The permissions issue was still there. The automation scripts were still configured with outdated access layers. And now the deployment timeline had been scheduled. Saturday night, unsupervised rollout. Operations are on standby to patch things quickly. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the monitoring dashboard glowing softly across my screen. For years, my instinct in situations like this had always been the same. Fix the problem early, send a clarification email, update the documentation, prevent the mistake before it reaches production. That's what a good operations coordinator does. But that afternoon, something unusual happened. For the first time, I paused before acting, not out of spite, not out of frustration, just a quiet moment of reflection, because I realized something simple. Everyone in the department believed they understood my role perfectly, reliable, helpful, always there to catch problems before they become visible. And the strange thing about expectations like that is how rarely people stop to confirm whether they're still accurate. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen during a conflict. And it definitely didn't happen during that Saturday deployment everyone had been discussing. It happened on a quiet Wednesday morning, long before the rollout date arrived. I remember the office was unusually calm that day. A few people were working from home, and the open floor felt more spacious than usual. Conversations were softer. The constant rhythm of keyboards and notifications had settled into something slower. I was reviewing documentation updates when an email notification appeared. It was from the architecture team. The subject line read, "Monitoring System, Final Integration Review." Curious, I opened it. Inside was a short message summarizing the final approval for the monitoring system deployment. Attached was the latest architecture packet, the same diagrams Marcus had been presenting in meetings. I scrolled through the document slowly. Most of it looked exactly the same automation workflow, the same database integration layer. And then I reached the page I had been watching for weeks. The permissions diagram, still unchanged. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Not because I was surprised anymore, because something about the repetition suddenly made the situation feel clearer. For the past several weeks, I had been treating the issue like a mistake, waiting to be corrected. But what if it wasn't? What if the real pattern wasn't about the diagram at all? What if the pattern was about something else entirely? I closed the document and opened our internal system access portal. Within a few seconds, I pulled up the current database permission structure. The change from 2 months ago was still there, clearly documented. Anyone who cross-checked the architecture diagram against the live environment would see the mismatch immediately, which meant something interesting. The people designing the system hadn't verified it against the operational environment, and the people reviewing the design hadn't asked operations to confirm it. Instead, the plan had moved forward based on assumptions. Assumptions that someone else, someone like me, would catch any inconsistencies later. That realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, like suddenly noticing the shape of something that had been in front of you the entire time. For years, I had been stepping in early to prevent exactly this type of oversight. Not because it was my formal responsibility, but because I knew the systems well enough to see potential problems before they reached production. But that morning, sitting alone at my desk with the architecture packet open in front of me, a simple question formed in my mind. What would happen if I stopped doing that automatically? Not out of resentment, not out of protest, just as an experiment in clarity. What would happen if the process unfolded exactly the way it had been designed, without the invisible adjustments I had been quietly making for years? The thought felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Operations culture trains you to prevent problems instinctively. Waiting for issues to surface goes against that instinct. But another thought followed close behind. The system rollout still had multiple review checkpoints before deployment. Engineering review, security verification, pre-launch testing, several opportunities for someone involved in the design process to verify the integration details. And if any of those teams noticed the permissions mismatch, they would correct it themselves, which meant there was no immediate risk. Just a process moving forward exactly as documented. I closed the architecture packet and returned to my monitoring dashboards. The office around me continued its quiet rhythm. Emails came in, meetings happened. People discussed timelines and deliverables as they always did. From the outside, nothing about that day looked unusual, but internally, something subtle had changed. For the first time in years, I made a conscious decision not to intervene, not to correct something preemptively, just to observe how the system, and the people managing it, would behave if everything proceeded exactly according to the plans they had approved. It wasn't a dramatic decision. It was quiet, almost invisible. But sometimes the most significant changes in a story begin the moment someone stops automatically doing what everyone else has come to rely on. After that Wednesday morning, the atmosphere at work didn't change. No one knew anything had shifted. The meetings continued exactly the same way they always had. Marcus presented updates, managers discussed timelines, and people nodded confidently at slides filled with diagrams and projected milestones. From the outside, I was still the same person I had always been. Quiet, organized, taking notes along the wall, but internally, something had become different. Before that morning, my silence had mostly been instinctive. When someone overlooked a detail or made a decision that didn't quite match the operational reality, I would eventually step in. Sometimes during a meeting, sometimes afterward in a quick message. It wasn't about recognition, it was about stability. Operations people are wired to protect systems from unnecessary risk. But now my silence had a different quality. It wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate. And that difference, though invisible to everyone else, changed the way I observe things. Over the next couple of weeks, the monitoring system project kept moving forward. The rollout date, Saturday night, remained fixed on the schedule. More meetings took place. More documents were finalized. And each time the architecture diagrams appeared, I noticed the same thing. No one questioned the database permissions layer, not the engineering team, not the security review, not the project managers tracking the timeline. Each group trusted that the previous group had already verified the details. It's a common phenomenon in large organizations. Responsibility becomes distributed across so many teams that everyone assumes someone else has already confirmed the critical pieces. Watching it happen in real time was strangely fascinating. I wasn't hoping for a problem, but I was learning something important. The system didn't rely on a single point of failure. It relied on a chain of assumptions. And for years, I had quietly been the person bridging those assumptions, checking things that technically fell outside my assigned responsibilities. Now that I wasn't doing that automatically, the process looked very different. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by my desk. He leaned casually against the divider and asked, "Hey, you've been following the monitoring rollout, right?" I nodded. "Yeah," I said. He smiled. "Good. Just wanted to make sure operations are ready in case anything weird pops up Saturday night." There it was again. The safety net. I kept my tone calm. "I'll be monitoring the system once deployment starts." "Perfect," he said. "Honestly, if anything breaks, you're the best person to spot it." Then he gave a friendly wave and walked away toward another meeting. I watched him go, then looked back at the dashboard on my screen. He wasn't wrong. I was probably the person most likely to spot an issue quickly. But noticing a problem and preventing it are two different actions. And for the first time in my career, I was intentionally allowing those actions to remain separate. The week moved quickly after that. Friday afternoon arrived with the usual rush of end-of-week conversations. People talked about weekend plans, last-minute deadlines, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from finishing another work cycle. By the time most of the office shut down for the evening, the monitoring system deployment was scheduled and ready. Saturday night, automated rollout, operations monitoring in the background. From every visible angle, the plan looked smooth. Responsible teams had signed off. The timeline had been approved. Documentation had been uploaded. Nothing about the situation suggested a serious problem waiting to happen. And yet, sitting at my desk before logging off that Friday, I opened my notebook and reviewed the two small notes I had written weeks earlier. Verify database permission mapping for monitoring scripts. Permissions map discrepancy still present in official documentation. Two simple observations. Nothing emotional is attached to them. Just facts. I closed the notebook and placed it back in my bag. The deployment would begin the next evening. And for the first time, instead of trying to shape what might happen, I had chosen something else entirely. To watch. If you had walked through our office during the weeks leading up to the deployment, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual about my routine. I still arrived early most mornings. The office before 9 o'clock had always been my favorite part of the day. The lights were softer, the conversations hadn't started yet, and the dashboards in the operations room glowed quietly without interruption. To anyone observing from the outside, I looked exactly the same as I always had. Laptop open, notebook beside it, reviewing system logs and documentation. But the way I was paying attention had changed. For years, my focus had always been reactive. If something looked like it might cause trouble later, I would step in early to smooth it out. Sometimes that meant clarifying documentation. Sometimes it meant quietly updating a configuration before it became an issue. Now I was doing something slightly different. I was documenting the process itself, not just the systems, the people, the approvals, the assumptions. One of the benefits of working in operations is that you see the entire life cycle of a project from a very practical perspective. While most teams focus on their specific phase, design, development, testing, operations eventually touches everything, which meant I had access to something interesting: the decision trail. Every architecture approval, every document upload, every timestamp shows who signed off on what and when. I wasn't digging for anything secret. All of it was already part of the company's internal records. Anyone with the right access could review it. The difference was that most people didn't. They trusted the process to function automatically. So over the next several days, during the quiet early hours of the morning, I began organizing information in my notebook in a slightly different way: the project timeline. Who had approved the architecture diagrams? Which teams had reviewed the database integration? Who had scheduled the final rollout window? Again, none of this was unusual. Operations teams track timelines constantly, but this time I was paying closer attention to something subtle: the gaps. For example, the architecture team had approved the monitoring design without cross-checking the database environment. Engineering had reviewed the automation scripts based on the architecture packet rather than the live infrastructure. Security had signed off on the system permissions, assuming the architecture diagram reflected the current database structure. Each group had technically done its job, but each group had also relied on a previous assumption being correct. And quietly in the background, I noticed something else. My name appeared repeatedly in the documentation, not as a decision maker, as the operations contact. The person who would monitor the system once deployment began. The person responsible for observing post-launch stability. In other words, the safety net. The more I looked at the timeline, the clearer the pattern became. The project wasn't built to fail, but it was built with the expectation that if something small slipped through the cracks, operations would catch it later, which had always been true, until now. Late one evening before the deployment weekend, I stayed a little longer than usual reviewing the monitoring dashboard configuration. The alert system was fully operational. If the automation scripts failed to connect properly to the database, the system would generate error logs within seconds, which meant if the permissions mismatch triggered a failure, it wouldn't stay hidden. The monitoring platform would record everything: time-stamped, objective, unambiguous. I leaned back in my chair and watched the quiet glow of the dashboard for a moment. There's a strange calm that comes from understanding exactly how a system will behave under pressure, not because you want something to break, but because you know that if it does, the evidence will be clear, and evidence, unlike opinions, doesn't argue. By the time the deployment weekend arrived, everything looked perfectly normal from the outside. The project was considered ready. Teams had moved on to other priorities, and no one seemed particularly worried about Saturday night. Why would they be? The documentation looked complete. The approvals were in place. The timeline had been carefully planned. What they didn't realize was that the invisible adjustments they had quietly come to rely on were no longer happening. Not because someone was sabotaging the process, simply because the process was finally being allowed to run exactly the way it had been designed. And systems have a very honest way of revealing the truth when that happens. Saturday nights in operations are usually quiet. That's the goal, after all. When a deployment is scheduled for the weekend, it's meant to happen while most of the company is offline. Fewer active users, fewer interruptions, fewer chances for small issues to ripple into larger ones. By the time the monitoring system rollout began, the office itself was almost empty. I wasn't physically there. Most weekend deployments were handled remotely, but the environment felt the same. Quiet dashboards, steady system activity. The soft rhythm of automated processes starts exactly on schedule. At 9:58 p.m., I logged into the operations monitoring console from my apartment. The deployment window was scheduled for 10 o'clock. I opened 3 panels on my screen: the main automation log, the database connection monitor, and the system alert feed. At exactly 10 p.m., the first deployment scripts were activated. A new service container was initialized. Configuration files loaded. The automation engine began executing the integration sequence that would link the monitoring platform to the company's internal databases. Everything looked normal at first, for about 6 seconds. Then the first message appeared in the automation log. Connection attempt, database authorization failed. Another line followed immediately. Retrying authentication. I watched quietly as the script attempted the connection again. And again. Each time, the system returned the same response: permission denied. The alert panel on the right side of my screen blinked softly as the monitoring platform registered the failure. A new log entry appeared. Monitoring integration incomplete. Alert escalation disabled. Technically, nothing catastrophic had happened. The deployment hadn't crashed the network. No data had been corrupted. The system itself was still running, but the core feature, the automated monitoring alerts that the entire project had been built around, wasn't functioning, exactly as the documentation had predicted it might. I leaned slightly closer to the screen and opened the detailed log view. The authentication request was attempting to access the database using the outdated permission structure from the architecture diagram, the one I had noticed weeks earlier. For a moment, I simply observed the system behavior. The automation script continued retrying the connection every 30 seconds. Each attempt produced the same error message. Eventually, the script entered standby mode, waiting for manual intervention. I could have fixed it in less than 5 minutes. Updating the access configuration was a simple adjustment. I had done similar corrections many times before during late-night deployments, but this time, I didn't immediately open the configuration panel. Instead, I reviewed the monitoring logs carefully. Every failure was being recorded, time-stamped, system-generated, neutral, no emotion attached to it. Just a clear technical record of what the system had attempted to do and why it had failed. After about 10 minutes, a new message appeared in my email inbox. It was an automated deployment notification sent to the project distribution list. Subject: Monitoring System Deployment. Phase 1 complete. The message summarized the rollout status. Services launched successfully. Integration scripts executed. Operations monitoring is active. I read the email once, then glanced back at the dashboard showing the repeated authentication failures. The message wasn't intentionally misleading. The deployment process had technically completed. But the monitoring integration, the actual purpose of the project, was still offline. And at that moment, something became very clear. The system itself had now documented the discrepancy. Not my notebook, not my opinion. The system. I opened the incident tracker and created a new internal operations note. Deployment observation. Monitoring integration. Authentication is failing due to outdated database permission mapping. Then I attached the relevant log entries. No commentary, just the facts. For a few minutes after that, the dashboards remained quiet. No one from engineering logged in. No urgent messages appeared. Most of the team probably assumed the deployment had gone smoothly, which meant something interesting. The truth about the system was already recorded, but almost no one had noticed it yet. I closed the detailed log panel and leaned back slightly in my chair. For weeks, the issue had existed quietly inside documentation. Now it existed inside the live environment. Visible, verifiable, waiting, not for me to correct it, but for someone else to finally see it. After the deployment scripts finished running that Saturday night, the dashboard settled into a steady rhythm again. Automation logs continued cycling. System resources looked stable. From a distance, everything appeared normal, except for one thing. The monitoring alerts, the very feature the project had been built to provide, were still inactive. The authentication failures continued appearing every 30 seconds in the background logs, quiet, consistent, documented. For a while, I simply watched. Operations work often involves long stretches of observation, and this moment felt strangely familiar. Not stressful, not urgent. Just a system behaving exactly according to the configuration it had been given. Around 10:40 p.m., a new login appeared in the monitoring console. One of the developers had connected remotely to check the deployment status. I saw their cursor move through a few dashboard panels before stopping on the main service health page. That screen showed what most people expected to see. Green indicators, running services, stable resource usage. Nothing alarming. After a couple of minutes, the developer logged out again. They hadn't opened the detailed integration logs, which meant the problem was still quietly sitting where it had first appeared. At that moment, I realized I had several choices. The simplest option would have been the one I had taken many times before. Open the configuration panel, update the database permission mapping, restart the automation script. Within minutes, the monitoring integration would activate, and the system would begin generating alerts exactly as planned. By Monday morning, everyone would assume the deployment had worked perfectly from the beginning. Another small issue quietly solved by operations. Another invisible adjustment kept the organization running smoothly. That path was familiar, comfortable, but there were other options too. I could send a message to Marcus explaining the situation. He would probably respond quickly, ask for the logs, and then coordinate with engineering to correct the architecture documentation. Again, the problem would disappear before most people even realized it had existed. But sitting there in front of the dashboard that night, I thought about something different. For weeks, the project had moved forward through multiple review stages: architecture, engineering, security, management. At each stage, people had approved the design based on the assumption that the previous stage had verified the details. Not maliciously, just confidently. And for years, I had been the person quietly bridging those assumptions before they became visible. But now the system itself had documented the result of those assumptions. Objectively, without interpretation. If I corrected the configuration immediately, that evidence would disappear. The process would look flawless. The same pattern would repeat the next time a project crossed departments, not because anyone intended it, because the system had never truly revealed the gap. I looked again at the incident note I had created earlier. The log entries were attached. The timestamps were clear. Anyone reviewing the deployment status carefully would eventually notice them. The question wasn't whether the issue would be fixed. It would be. The question was when and by whom. After a few minutes of quiet consideration, I made a simple decision. I left the configuration unchanged. Not to cause a failure, not to embarrass anyone, just to allow the system to continue recording the reality of the deployment exactly as it was happening. Then I set a monitoring alert for myself in case the issue escalated into something larger. Once that was done, I closed the console and shut down my laptop. The apartment around me was silent. Outside, the city lights reflected faintly across the window. Somewhere across town, the servers were still running, still attempting their database connections every 30 seconds. And each time they failed, the logs quietly added another line to the story. A story that, by Monday morning, someone else would eventually have to read. Monday mornings in our department usually began slowly. People arrived with coffee, opened their laptops, and spent the first half hour catching up on emails and weekend updates. It was the calm before the usual rhythm of meetings and project discussions took over. That Monday looked exactly the same, which was interesting because by the time most of the team walked into the office, the monitoring system had already spent nearly 36 hours trying and failing to authenticate with the company's databases. Every attempt had been logged. Every retry is timestamped. From a systems perspective, the evidence had been accumulating all weekend quietly, but no one had noticed yet. At 8:12 a.m., I logged into the operations console from my desk and opened the integration dashboard. The error counter had climbed steadily. Hundreds of authentication failures. Nothing catastrophic. The scripts were designed to retry indefinitely until the correct permissions were provided. But the system still wasn't performing the task it had been built to perform. The alert pipeline remained inactive, which meant the new monitoring platform wasn't actually monitoring anything yet. I took a sip of coffee and reviewed the incident note I had created Saturday night. The log entries were still attached exactly as I had left them. Neutral, clear, waiting. Around 8:45 a.m., Marcus walked into the office carrying a laptop bag and a paper cup from the cafe across the street. He looked relaxed, the kind of relax that comes from believing a weekend deployment had gone smoothly. He stopped near my desk. "Morning, Eulalia," he said. "Morning. How'd the rollout look Saturday night?" I turned slightly toward him and answered calmly. The services were deployed on schedule, which was true. The containers had launched exactly as planned. Marcus nodded, satisfied. "Good. I figured everything would be fine." Then he walked toward the conference room where the weekly project check-in was scheduled. I watched him go for a moment, then returned to my dashboard. At 9:05 a.m., the engineering team joined the monitoring system workspace to review post-deployment metrics. I could see their activity through the system logs as they opened dashboards and checked performance indicators. Most of the high-level panels looked healthy: server uptime, memory usage, process stability, all green. But eventually, inevitably, someone opened the integration log panel. A new cursor appeared on my screen as one of the developers expanded the error list. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the internal chat channel lit up. "Dev, Aaron. Hey." Does anyone know why the monitoring service keeps failing DB auth? A second message followed quickly. Dev. Aaron. There are a lot of these errors. Within minutes, several more engineers joined the console. I watched the log viewer populate with new users, reading the same entries I had seen on Saturday night. The same messages, the same timestamps. Marcus appeared in the channel next. Marcus. Wait, when did this start? Aaron scrolled further up the logs. Aaron. Looks like right after deployment. There was a brief pause in the chat. Then another message appeared. Aaron. Permissions mismatch, maybe? I leaned back slightly in my chair. No one had mentioned my name yet. No one had asked operations to fix anything. They were simply reading the system logs and following the evidence where it led, which, in many ways, was the most honest way for a technical team to discover a problem. A few minutes later, Marcus walked quickly across the office toward the engineering desks. I could hear the low murmur of conversation starting as the team gathered around a shared screen. Curiosity, confusion, technical troubleshooting. Still calm, but the atmosphere had begun to shift. Because the question wasn't just why the integration had failed. It was also how a system that had passed multiple review stages had launched with a configuration mismatch that was visible within seconds. And somewhere inside the deployment records, the answer to that question already existed, quietly waiting for someone to connect the dots. By 9:30 that morning, the atmosphere in the engineering section had changed, not dramatically. There were no raised voices, no visible panic, just a subtle tightening of focus. Several developers were now gathered around a large screen reviewing the monitoring logs together. I could hear fragments of conversation drifting across the office. Short technical questions, quick suggestions, the sound of someone scrolling rapidly through documentation. The kind of energy that appears when a team realizes something small might not be as small as it first looked. From my desk, I continued reviewing the operations dashboard the same way I always did, quietly, observing. The authentication failures were still appearing every 30 seconds, but now they weren't invisible anymore. Aaron's voice carried across the room. Okay, this is weird. The script is using the old permission structure. Someone else responded. That shouldn't even exist in the architecture packet. Marcus spoke next, more slowly. Let me see the diagram again. A few seconds passed. Then the room became noticeably quieter, because when they opened the architecture documentation, they found the same diagram everyone had approved weeks earlier. The outdated permissions layer, still sitting there, exactly where it had always been. Another developer said, "Didn't we review this with architecture?" "Yeah," someone replied. They signed off. Marcus frowned slightly at the screen. Security also cleared the integration. Now the conversation was no longer about the error message. It was about the process. Who had validated the design? Who had confirmed the infrastructure alignment? And why none of those checkpoints had caught the discrepancy? At 9:47 a.m., Marcus opened the internal chat channel again. Marcus. Does anyone know when the database permissions were updated? Within seconds, someone from the infrastructure team responded. Infra, Jenna. That change happened about 2 months ago when we reorganized the database clusters. Marcus typed another message. Marcus. Was that documented somewhere? Jenna replied almost immediately. Infra, Jenna. Yeah, it's in the environment update log. We sent a notice when it went live. A few developers began searching through the shared documentation repository. More silence followed. Then Aaron spoke again. Found it. He turned his laptop so the others could see the screen. The environment update log clearly described the database permission restructuring. The date, the details, everything. Marcus rubbed his forehead briefly. So the architecture diagram never got updated. No one answered right away, because the implication was obvious. The design review had relied on outdated documentation. The engineering team had built its scripts based on that documentation. Security had approved the configuration, assuming the architecture packet reflected the live environment. Every stage had technically followed the procedure, but the procedure itself had quietly drifted away from reality. At that point, Marcus glanced across the office. Not directly at me, more like scanning the room. Then his eyes paused for a moment. Eulalia, he called. I looked up calmly. Yeah? You monitor the infrastructure updates, right? I review them, yes. Did you see the database permission change when it happened? I did. He nodded slowly. And the monitoring system integration? Did you notice the mismatch before deployment? The question wasn't aggressive, it was practical, the kind of question someone asks while trying to reconstruct a timeline. I met his gaze and answered honestly, yes. For a second, the room grew very quiet. Marcus tilted his head slightly. And you didn't flag it? I paused briefly before replying. I mentioned the permission structure during the first architecture meeting. Several people in the room looked toward Marcus. Aaron said quietly, "Wait, that was brought up?" Marcus frowned, thinking. Then recognition flickered across his face. "You said something about the access layer." I nodded. "Yes." No one spoke for a few seconds after that. Not because anyone was angry, because the chain of events had just become very clear. The information had been present. The warning had existed. It simply hadn't been treated as important enough to examine at the time. And now the system logs were reflecting the cost of that oversight. Not a disaster, not a crisis. Just a problem that could have been prevented if someone had paused long enough to listen carefully the first time. Across the room, the developers turned back to the screen to begin correcting the configuration. But something subtle had already shifted. Not in the system, in the way the room looked at me. By late morning, the engineering team had already identified the solution. From a purely technical standpoint, the fix was simple. Update the database permission mapping. Restart the authentication script. Reactivate the monitoring alert pipeline. The actual configuration change took less than 10 minutes. But the longer conversation unfolding around it was not about how to fix the system. It was about when the system had actually started failing and who knew about it. Aaron scrolled through the monitoring logs again, this time focusing on the timestamps. First authentication error, Saturday at 10 p.m. Another developer leaned closer to the screen. And it's been retrying every 30 seconds since then. Marcus crossed his arms. So the integration has basically been offline all weekend. Aaron nodded slowly. Yeah. A small silence settled over the group. Because the monitoring system wasn't just another internal tool. It had been introduced as an important upgrade, an automated platform that would detect system issues early and notify the appropriate teams. That was the whole purpose of the project. And for nearly 2 full days, that capability simply hadn't existed. Not because the servers were broken, not because the code was unstable, but because a single diagram was wrong. Marcus eventually asked the obvious question. Did anyone check the integration logs after the deployment email went out? No one answered immediately. One developer shrugged slightly. I assumed operations had verified everything. Another said, the deployment summary looked clean. Marcus exhaled quietly. Right. Across the room, someone finally applied the corrected database permissions. The automation script restarted. For a few seconds, the log window remained still. Then a new message appeared. Database authentication successful. A few seconds later, the monitoring platform activated its alert pipeline. Green indicators appeared across the dashboard. From that moment forward, the system was technically working exactly the way it had been designed. Problem solved. Except for one thing. The system logs still contain nearly 48 hours of failed authentication attempts. Hundreds of them. Each one is time-stamped. Each one showed that the monitoring platform had been unable to perform its job since the moment the deployment began. And those logs were permanent. You can correct a configuration, but you can't erase the timeline of what already happened. Marcus sat down at one of the desks and opened the deployment documentation again. He scrolled through the architecture packet slowly. Then he said something almost to himself. This past architecture review, engineering review, and security verification. Aaron nodded. And it still launched with a broken integration. Someone else added quietly, because the diagram was outdated. Marcus looked up, which means nobody cross-checked it against the live infrastructure. The statement wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It was simply the conclusion that the evidence supported. After a moment, Marcus turned toward me again. You said you mentioned the permissions mismatch in the first meeting. Yes. Did anyone follow up on it afterward? No. Another brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful, because the situation wasn't about blame anymore. The system had already revealed what had happened. A detail had been raised. It had been acknowledged briefly. Then it had disappeared inside the flow of the meeting. And once the project timeline accelerated, no one returned to verify it. Except the logs had. Quietly, relentlessly, documenting every failed attempt until someone finally looked closely enough to see the pattern. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the room. "Well," he said calmly, "we're going to need to explain this. Not in an angry way, in a procedural way, because when a deployment doesn't perform as expected, especially one that involves multiple teams, someone eventually asks for a review of what happened. And by that point, the explanation no longer belongs to opinions, it belongs to the record. The emails, the approvals, the documentation, and the quiet log entries that had been accumulating since Saturday night, entries that, by now, told a very complete story. A few days after the meeting, Daniel asked if we could talk. His voice was polite, almost careful. We sat in a small conference room that suddenly felt very quiet. For a moment he didn't say anything, then he finally spoke. "I didn't realize how much of this you were carrying," he said. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close. I nodded once. "I wasn't carrying it alone," I replied calmly. "I was just the only one paying attention to it." He looked down at the table. I could see the realization settling in, the slow understanding that this situation hadn't appeared overnight. It had grown over time, ignored, unnoticed, until it became impossible to overlook. "I wish we had handled things differently," he said quietly. "I know," I answered. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just the simple truth. But some moments don't need dramatic endings. This was one of them. We stood, shook hands, and left the room. Not as enemies, just as two people who finally understood what had happened. Life after that morning became surprisingly quiet. Not dramatic, not triumphant. Just steady. My role changed. Not only in the title, but in how people saw me. Colleagues who once overlooked my ideas now listened more carefully. Meetings felt different. Not because I demanded attention, but because people had finally realized what had always been there. But the biggest change wasn't around me. It was inside me. I stopped feeling the need to prove myself. I stopped worrying about whether people noticed my work. Because the truth is, respect earned slowly tends to last longer. Now, when I walk into a room, I don't feel invisible anymore. Not because I'm louder, but because I no longer question my own value. This story isn't really about office politics. It's about something many of us experience at some point. Being underestimated, being overlooked, and deciding how to respond. Some people choose to argue, some choose to walk away. I chose something different. I chose patience. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't confrontation. Sometimes it's simply continuing to do your work with quiet confidence. Over time, consistency speaks louder than any explanation ever could. And when recognition finally arrives, it doesn't feel like revenge. It feels like clarity. So I'm curious about your experience. Have you ever been underestimated at work or in life? And when that happened, did you confront it directly? Or did you let time and your actions speak for you?